The crystalline halls of the ethereal court had always made Darius Kane feel like he was walking through the inside of a prism. But today, they seemed particularly intent on refracting his anxiety into 1,000 different shades of panic. The ceasefire negotiations had collapsed spectacularly 3 hours ago, and now he was standing before Queen Seraphine with what was either the most brilliant diplomatic maneuver of his career or the most elaborate form of professional suicide ever attempted. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice only slightly betraying the fact that his heart was trying to escape through his throat, "I formally request to be taken as your consort." The silence that followed was so profound that Darius could hear the quantum harmonics of the palace walls adjusting to accommodate the emotional resonance of 67 different species of courtiers, all holding their breath simultaneously. Queen Seraphine sat upon her floating throne, her silver skin shifting through subtle hues that Darius had learned to read over months of negotiations. Right now, she was cycling through what he tentatively identified as amusement, surprise, and something that might have been satisfaction. Her forearms were positioned in a configuration that his cultural briefings had labeled contemplative authority, though he suspected the briefings hadn't covered situations quite this unprecedented. "Ambassador Kane," she replied, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in his chest cavity, "that is quite an interesting proposal. I understand it's unconventional, Your Majesty, but given the current crisis—" "Do you?" she interrupted, and there was something in her tone that made the crystal walls hum with barely contained energy. "Do you understand why you wanted me as your consort?" The question hit him like a solar flare to the cognitive processes. "I what?" "You asked why you wanted me as your consort, past tense, as if this decision had already been made." Her 4 eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel like he was being analyzed at the molecular level. "Tell me, Ambassador, what do you remember about your first diplomatic posting?" "This is my first diplomatic posting, Your Majesty. I was assigned to the ethereal negotiations directly from the Academy. And before the Academy, I was selected from the civilian population based on aptitude tests and psychological profiles." Darius frowned, suddenly aware that several courtiers were leaning forward with what appeared to be predatory interest. Standard recruitment protocols. How fascinating. Seraphine rose from her throne, her movements carrying the fluid grace of someone who had evolved in environments where gravity was more of a suggestion than a law. "And your family history, your genetic lineage?" "Your Majesty, I'm not sure I understand the relevance." "Humor me. My parents were agricultural workers on Kepler 442b. Standard colonial stock, nothing remarkable. Third-generation terraformers." He was beginning to feel like he was standing in the middle of a conversation he hadn't been invited to. "May I ask why this matters to our current situation?" Queen Seraphine approached him with steps that seemed to make the crystal floor sing in frequencies just below his hearing threshold. When she was close enough that he could see the subtle patterns of light flowing beneath her translucent skin, she smiled. "Because, dear Ambassador, I chose you first." "I'm sorry, what?" 3 years, 7 months, and 16 days ago, to be precise, when you were still studying xenobiology and dreaming of becoming a research scientist rather than a diplomat." The court erupted in whispers that sounded like wind chimes caught in a hurricane. Darius felt his knees develop a sudden and concerning interest in the concept of structural failure. "That's impossible. We've never met before the negotiations began." "Haven't we?" She extended one of her hands, long-fingered, elegant, with skin that seemed to contain galaxies of shifting silver stars. "May I?" Before he could ask what she intended to do, her palm pressed against his chest, directly over his heart. The moment she made contact, something extraordinary happened. The palace's quantum harmonics shifted into a complex rhythm that seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat, and every piece of technology in the throne room began to glow with soft, pulsing light. "Magnificent," Seraphine whispered. "The crown code is even stronger than our geneticists predicted." "Crown code? Your Majesty, I really think there's been some kind of mistake." "No mistake, Ambassador. Your heartbeat carries a genetic signature that was woven into your bloodline 7 generations ago. A collaboration between our species that predates the current conflict by centuries." The throne room felt like it was tilting slightly, though Darius was fairly certain that was just his sense of reality undergoing rapid structural reorganization. Genetic signature, collaboration. "Your Majesty, my family has no history of contact with the ethereal dominion. Your family was selected, carefully guided, and their genetic markers enhanced over multiple generations to produce exactly what you are now." Her other 3 hands joined the first, creating a complex pattern of contact that made his nervous system hum with alien harmonics. A perfect diplomatic bridge, a living key to our defense networks. A consort whose bond with the crown would be unbreakable. "You're telling me my entire existence has been engineered, guided, shaped, optimized." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to tones that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and speak directly to his bones. "And now, after all these years of patient cultivation, you've come to me asking to be my consort. But I assumed this was my idea, a desperate diplomatic gambit to prevent renewed warfare. Was it?" Her 4 eyes studied his face with an expression that might have been compassionate if it weren't so thoroughly alien. "Or was it the inevitable result of genetic programming finally reaching its intended conclusion?" Darius tried to step back, but found that his legs seemed to have developed philosophical objections to the concept of movement. "This is insane. People don't just carry around genetic codes in their heartbeats. Hearts don't work that way." "Human hearts don't work that way," Seraphine agreed. "But your heart isn't entirely human anymore, is it?" As if summoned by her words, he became suddenly, acutely aware of his own cardiovascular system. His heartbeat, which he'd never given much conscious thought to, seemed to be following patterns that were far too complex for simple muscle contractions. Rhythms within rhythms, harmonics that resonated with the palace's quantum fields, frequencies that made the alien technology around him respond like instruments recognizing their conductor. How is this possible?" 7 generations of careful genetic modification, Ambassador. Introduced through medical treatments, environmental exposure, selective breeding guidance. Her touch was growing warmer, and he could feel something like electricity flowing between her skin and his. All leading to this moment, when the crown code in your DNA finally encounters its intended counterpart. And what happens now? Queen Seraphine's private chambers were a study in controlled chaos, crystalline formations that grew from floor to ceiling like frozen music, holographic displays showing star charts that moved in patterns too complex for human eyes to follow, and what appeared to be a small garden where the plants glowed with their own internal light and definitely weren't following any terrestrial concepts of botany. "I apologize for the abrupt relocation," she said, gesturing with 2 of her arms while the other 2 poured something that looked like liquid starlight into elegant vessels. "But court protocol demands that certain conversations happen away from the faction representatives." Faction representatives? Darius was still trying to process the revelation that his entire existence had been a genetic engineering project. "Your Majesty, I'm having trouble keeping up with the political implications here." "Please call me Seraphine. If we're going to be discussing your potential integration into the royal neural network, formal titles seem rather redundant." "My what now?" She handed him one of the vessels, which was warm to the touch and humming with barely audible harmonics. "The beverage is safe for human consumption. We've been preparing for your arrival for quite some time, as you might imagine." Darius took a cautious sip, and discovered it tasted like cinnamon mixed with cosmic background radiation. This is all happening rather quickly. 3 years of careful orchestration tends to accelerate once the key components are in position. Seraphine settled onto what might have been a chair or possibly a crystallized cloud. Though I should clarify something important. While your genetic modifications were initiated by our collaborative project, your personality, your curiosity, your rather charming tendency to make jokes when nervous, those are entirely your own. How reassuring. So I'm a genetically modified diplomatic tool with authentic emotional responses. You're a person, Darius. A person whose bloodline carries certain useful characteristics, but a person nonetheless. Her skin shifted to warmer hues, and he was learning to recognize this as her equivalent of a smile. Though I must admit, your sense of humor wasn't something our geneticists anticipated. That appears to be a delightful bonus feature. Glad my personality comes with optional extras. He took another sip of the cosmic cinnamon. Can you explain what happens if we actually go through with this consort arrangement? Because I'm getting the impression it involves more than just ceremonial marriage and state dinners. The ceremonial union would activate the crown code in your DNA, linking your consciousness to the royal neural network. You would gain access to our defensive systems, our strategic databases, and the collective wisdom of 17 previous monarchs. She paused, studying his expression. You would also become biologically dependent on proximity to the crown consciousness. Separation for more than a few days would be uncomfortable. Define uncomfortable. Imagine the worst case of homesickness you've ever experienced, combined with the sensation that half your thoughts are missing, seasoned with a neurochemical withdrawal that makes standard addiction look like a minor preference for particular brands of coffee. Right, so complete autonomy becomes a thing of the past. In exchange for ending a war that has claimed millions of lives across both our peoples. Her 4 eyes met his, and he could see something like regret flickering in their depths. The defense networks linked to your crown code would give us overwhelming military advantage. Your people would have no choice but to accept permanent peace terms. Darius set down his vessel, suddenly finding the cosmic cinnamon less appealing. Peace through absolute surrender. Peace through the elimination of military options. Sometimes the threat of overwhelming force is more effective than the use of it. And if I refuse, the ceasefires will collapse completely within 72 hours. The faction leaders on both sides have already begun mobilizing for full-scale war. She rose and moved to one of the holographic displays, her movements carrying a grace that seemed to defy several laws of physics. Your people will fight bravely, but they lack the technological advantages necessary for anything beyond a prolonged and bloody defeat. So my choices are become a willing prisoner with benefits, or watch my species get systematically exterminated. Those are the political realities, yes. She turned back to him, and her expression was genuinely sorrowful. I wish I could offer you better options, Darius, but the genetic modifications that make you perfect for this role also make you irreplaceable. Without the crown code activation, the defense networks remain dormant, and without those networks, we lack the decisive advantage necessary to end this conflict quickly. How long have you known? About me, I mean. I've been monitoring your development since your 15th birthday. Academic performance, psychological profiles, stress responses under various conditions. Her skin shifted through colors that suggested embarrassment. I realize how that sounds. It sounds like stalking with extra steps and genetic engineering. It sounds like that because it essentially was that. She returned to her seat, all 4 hands now fidgeting with what appeared to be nervous energy. But Darius, you must understand, watching you grow into the person you became, seeing your compassion, your intelligence, your absolutely terrible jokes, somewhere along the way, the surveillance became something else entirely. Something else. Admiration, affection, genuine caring for your well-being. She looked down at her hands, a gesture that was surprisingly human despite her decidedly non-human physiology. When you asked to be my consort today, my first emotion wasn't political satisfaction or strategic triumph. It was joy. Joy that your 7-generation breeding program had finally reached its intended conclusion. Joy that the person I had grown to care about was finally here, in my presence, asking to stay. She met his eyes again. The crown code made you compatible with our technology. It didn't make you kind, or brilliant, or brave enough to walk into a throne room and propose marriage to an alien queen as a desperate peace gambit. Darius felt something shift in his chest, a sensation that might have been his genetically modified heart responding to proximity to its intended counterpart, or might just have been the recognition that even in the middle of the most complicated political situation in galactic history, he was talking to someone who understood him. Seraphine, can I ask you something? Anything. If the crown code integration makes me dependent on proximity to you, what does it do to you? Her skin flushed through a spectrum of colors he hadn't seen before, settling on something that looked like silver shot through with gold. It creates a reciprocal bond. Your thoughts become accessible to me. Your emotions resonate through the neural network. In your terms, I believe the closest analogy would be that we become two parts of the same consciousness. So we both lose our autonomy. We gain something that transcends individual autonomy. But yes, we both sacrifice the ability to exist as entirely separate beings. And you're willing to do that. Darius, I chose you 3 years ago. Not because the geneticists told me you were compatible, but because watching you grow into yourself was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. She stood again, moving closer until he could feel the warmth radiating from her alien skin. I have been willing to share consciousness with you since long before you knew I existed. He looked up at her, this being who was simultaneously the culmination of his species' diplomatic hopes and the person who had been caring about his well-being from a distance for years. This is insane, he said finally. Completely. The political ramifications alone could destabilize half the galaxy. Almost certainly. And there's no guarantee the neural integration won't have unforeseen consequences. None whatsoever. When do we start? The Gene Forge installations beneath the ethereal palace were simultaneously the most beautiful and most terrifying things Darius had ever seen. Crystalline chambers stretched into darkness like the ribcage of some impossible creature, while streams of what looked like liquid DNA flowed through transparent conduits, carrying the building blocks of life from one processing station to another. 7 generations of your family's genetic modifications were planned and implemented in facilities like this, Seraphine explained, her voice echoing strangely in the vast underground spaces. Though I suspect you're beginning to understand that the scope of the project was somewhat larger than we initially indicated. Define somewhat larger, Darius said, studying readouts that showed genetic tracking data for what appeared to be thousands of different bloodlines across dozens of worlds. 43 species, 217 worlds, approximately 15 million individuals whose genetic development has been guided over the past 3 centuries. She moved through the installation with the confidence of someone who had spent considerable time here. The ethereal dominion and the human coalition weren't the only civilizations involved in this project. This is a galactic-scale breeding program. This is a galactic-scale attempt to create biological compatibility between species that evolved in completely different environments with entirely different evolutionary pressures. Her skin was cycling through colors that suggested deep discomfort with the conversation. The alternative was permanent warfare between incompatible forms of consciousness. Darius stopped walking, suddenly understanding the true scope of what he was seeing. You're not just engineering consorts, you're engineering an entire diplomatic class. Individuals who can interface with multiple species technologies, who carry genetic markers that allow for biological bonding across evolutionary boundaries, who can serve as living bridges between civilizations that would otherwise remain forever alien to each other. She gestured at the data streams flowing around them. 15 million potential diplomats, each one carrying crown codes specific to different combinations of species and political structures. And if any of them refuse to play their assigned roles, then the wars continue, the incompatibilities remain unresolved, and eventually one species becomes dominant through military superiority rather than cooperation. She turned to face him, her 4 eyes reflecting the bioluminescent glow of the gene forges. This project represents the alternative to extinction-level conflict. The alternative to extinction-level conflict is extinction-level social engineering. Yes, the simple honesty of her response hit him harder than any elaborate justification would have. She wasn't trying to convince him this was ethical or right. She was acknowledging that they were all trapped in a situation where every available choice carried horrific consequences. Seraphine, what happens to the people who don't know they're carrying crown codes? What happens when they find out their entire existence has been manipulated? Civil unrest on a scale that makes our current war look like a minor disagreement. She moved deeper into the installation, leading him past chambers where genetic samples from across the galaxy were being analyzed, modified, and prepared for implementation, which is why the project has been classified at the highest levels of every participating government, and which is why exposing it would collapse the carefully maintained balance of power that's been holding the galaxy together. Exposing it would also reveal that most of the natural, evolutionary developments of the past 3 centuries have been artificially guided. The philosophical implications alone would destabilize every major civilization. They reached a central chamber where holographic displays showed real-time monitoring of crown code carriers across known space. Darius could see his own biological signature prominently displayed, along with detailed analyses of his psychological development, stress responses, and compatibility ratings with various species. "I can see myself," he said, studying the data with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. "My entire life quantified and categorized. Your life and the lives of everyone else in the program." Seraphine's voice carried a weight that suggested she found this as disturbing as he did, including my own. "Your own? Did you think the ethereal royal bloodline was exempt from genetic modification?" She gestured at another display, this one showing her own biological data stretching back through multiple generations. "My genetic markers have been enhanced for compatibility with crown code carriers. My neural structure modified to interface with multiple consciousness types. My emotional responses calibrated for optimal diplomatic bonding." So neither of us is entirely natural. Neither of us had the luxury of developing without interference. She moved closer to him, her presence causing the monitoring systems to register increased resonance between their respective crown codes. "But that doesn't make our connection artificial, Darius. Compatibility isn't the same as predetermined emotion. How can we tell the difference? Because if our feelings were simply the result of genetic programming, this conversation would be unnecessary. We would have completed the bonding process without question or doubt." Her hand found his, and the gene forge systems around them hummed with increased activity. The fact that we're both questioning, both struggling with the ethical implications, both choosing to proceed despite our reservations, that's the part of us that exists beyond the programming. Or it's exactly the kind of behavior the programmers wanted us to exhibit to ensure we made the choice they wanted us to make. That's entirely possible. Her skin shifted to colors that conveyed rueful amusement. But at some point, we have to decide whether to live as if our agency matters, even if we can't prove it does. The chamber around them pulsed with activity, as their proximity triggered responses in the gene forge monitoring systems. Displays lit up showing potential outcomes, compatibility ratings, projected success probabilities for various diplomatic scenarios. "The systems are responding to us being here together," Darius observed. "They're calculating the optimal timing for crown code activation based on our current biological and psychological states." She squeezed his hand, and the displays showed probability curves shifting in real time. "According to the projections, we have approximately 18 hours before the window for voluntary activation closes. And then what happens? The faction leaders will demand immediate ceremonial union to prevent renewed warfare. If we refuse, they'll attempt to force activation through less pleasant methods." Her grip on his hand tightened. "And if we comply, we complete a project 3 centuries in the making while potentially sacrificing any hope of authentic relationship. Unless we choose a third option, which would be, we expose everything. The gene forges, the crown codes, the breeding programs, all of it." He gestured at the installation around them. "We tell 15 million people that their bloodlines have been manipulated, inform 43 species that their evolution has been guided, and let the galaxy decide how it wants to handle the consequences. That would cause chaos on a scale unprecedented in galactic history. It would also give people the right to make informed choices about their own lives. It would likely result in the collapse of multiple governments and the destruction of the careful balance that's prevented larger-scale warfare. And it would mean that whatever happens next happens because people chose it, not because they were manipulated into it by genetic programming they didn't know existed." Seraphine was quiet for a long moment, studying the displays that showed their biological signatures beginning to synchronize just from prolonged proximity. "There's something else you should know," she said finally. "If we expose the Gene Forge project, it won't just destabilize the current political structure. It will also invalidate the crown codes that were designed to prevent species-level conflicts." Meaning that without the artificial compatibility markers, our species really will be too different to coexist peacefully. The wars will resume, but this time without any possibility of diplomatic resolution. So our choices are: accept the manipulation and live with artificial peace, or reject the manipulation and face authentic extinction. Those appear to be the options, yes. Darius looked around the Gene Forge installation, at the crystalline chambers that had been shaping life across the galaxy for centuries, at the displays showing the biological signatures of 15 million people who had no idea their existence was part of someone else's plan. "Well," he said finally, "when you put it that way, the choice seems obvious." The joint session of the Ethereal Court and Human Coalition Council had all the dignity and calm deliberation of a supernova having an argument with a black hole. Representatives from 43 species filled the vast chamber, their various forms of agitation creating a cacophony that the translation systems were struggling to keep up with. "This is either the bravest thing we've ever done or the most catastrophically stupid," Darius muttered to Seraphine as they approached the central platform where their testimony would literally reshape the future of galactic civilization. "Why can't it be both?" she replied, her skin cycling through colors that suggested she was experiencing approximately 17 different types of anxiety simultaneously. The revelation of the Gene Forge project had taken exactly 4 hours to spread across known space, and the reaction had been everything they'd anticipated, and several things they hadn't. 3 governments had already collapsed. 2 species had declared independence from their respective coalitions, and someone had apparently started a petition to have all crown code carriers launched into the nearest convenient star. "Citizens and representatives of the Galactic Assembly," Darius began, his voice amplified by systems that made every word resonate in frequencies appropriate to each species' hearing range. "We stand before you today to explain why we chose to destroy the most ambitious peacekeeping project in recorded history." The immediate response was a sound like 43 different concepts of shouting all happening at once. The Gene Forge installations created biological compatibility where none existed naturally. Seraphine continued when the chaos subsided to merely deafening levels. They eliminated the evolutionary barriers that made true cooperation impossible between our species. And they did so without the knowledge or consent of the 15 million individuals whose bloodlines were modified. And now you've condemned us all to extinction. This from Admiral Rodriguez of the Human Coalition, whose normally impressive composure had deteriorated significantly over the past 4 hours. Without the Crown Code compatibility protocols, we'll be back to species-level warfare within a generation. Unless, Darius said, and his voice carried the tone of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about this exact problem, we choose to find other solutions. Such as conscious cooperation instead of biologically enforced compatibility, deliberate choice instead of genetic programming, the hard work of building relationships across evolutionary boundaries without the shortcuts provided by artificial modifications. The chamber erupted again, this time with what sounded like 43 different ways of expressing incredulous disbelief. You destroyed our best hope for peace because you preferred the hard way. This from Counselor Vexter of the crystalline hegemony, whose mineral-based physiology made their frustration sound like grinding stone. We destroyed a system of control that treated 15 million people as tools in someone else's political project, Seraphine responded. The peace you're mourning was built on a foundation of genetic slavery. And the war you've triggered will be built on a foundation of corpses, Admiral Rodriguez shot back. Actually, said a new voice from the assembly floor, that might not be necessary. Dr. Elena Vasquez, xenobiologist and apparently the galaxy's leading expert on improvised diplomatic solutions, approached the central platform with the confidence of someone who had spent the last 4 hours developing a completely insane plan that might actually work. The Crown Codes are invalidated, yes, but the individuals who carry them still exist. Their enhanced compatibility markers are still functional, they just don't have the artificial compulsion to use them. She activated a holographic display that showed the biological signatures of Crown Code carriers across known space. What if instead of forcing compatibility through genetic programming, we offered it as a choice? Explain, Seraphine said, her ears perking up with interest. Voluntary integration. Crown Code carriers who choose to participate in diplomatic partnerships receive full disclosure about their modifications, complete autonomy over their decisions, and the option to withdraw at any time. Dr. Vasquez gestured at the data streams flowing around them. We keep the biological compatibility that makes cooperation possible, but we eliminate the coercive elements that made it ethically problematic. You're suggesting we rebuild the entire diplomatic structure of galactic civilization on the basis of people volunteering for complicated biological partnerships with alien species, Admiral Rodriguez said slowly. I'm suggesting we offer people the choice to participate in building something better than what came before, Dr. Vasquez replied. Something based on informed consent rather than genetic manipulation. Darius looked at Seraphine, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her 4 eyes. It could work. It could catastrophically fail and result in the collapse of interspecies cooperation across known space, she pointed out. True, but it could also succeed and create the first genuinely consensual diplomatic framework in galactic history. The risks are enormous, but so are the potential benefits. He took her hand, feeling the Crown Code resonance that still existed between them despite the exposure of the Gene Forge project. And we'd be making the choice together, with full knowledge of what we're agreeing to. The assembly had grown quiet, waiting for their decision. The weight of 15 million Crown Code carriers, 43 species, and countless future generations pressed down on the chamber like a collapsing star. There's something else, Seraphine said, her voice carrying across the vast space. If we proceed with voluntary integration, if we choose to accept the biological bonding while maintaining our autonomy, we'll be serving as a test case for whether consensual compatibility partnerships can work. And if they can't, asked Counselor Vexter, then we'll have proven that artificial peace was better than authentic chaos, and future generations can make their decisions accordingly. She squeezed Darius's hand, but if they can work, then we'll have proven that people can choose to cooperate across evolutionary boundaries without being forced to do so by genetic programming, Darius finished. We'll have demonstrated that consciousness can transcend biology when it chooses to. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone had expected. 37 species voted to attempt the voluntary integration framework, 6 voted against, and 1 abstained on the grounds that their concept of democracy was incompatible with making decisions about other people's biological modifications. 3 months later, Darius stood in the same crystal chamber where he had first proposed to become Seraphine's consort, this time with full knowledge of what that meant and complete freedom to change his mind. "Are you ready?" she asked, her skin glowing with patterns that conveyed affection, nervousness, and anticipation in equal measure. "I'm ready to try," he replied, "with the understanding that if this doesn't work the way we hope, we'll figure out something else." Together, the Crown Code activation was unlike anything the Gene-Forge designers had anticipated. Instead of creating biological dependency, the conscious choice to integrate seemed to enhance the autonomy of both participants. Darius found himself sharing thoughts with Seraphine while maintaining his individual identity, accessing her emotional responses while preserving his own. The defense networks came online, but their activation felt different, less like weapons being prepared for war and more like tools being offered for cooperation. The strategic databases opened, but their information seemed focused on collaboration rather than conquest. "This is," Darius began, "not what the programming intended," Seraphine finished, "but exactly what we chose." 6 months later, the voluntary integration program had attracted over 3,000 Crown Code carriers across known space. Not all the partnerships worked, but enough of them succeeded to demonstrate that conscious cooperation could achieve what genetic manipulation had only simulated. The wars didn't end immediately, but they changed. Instead of conflicts between incompatible species, they became negotiations between beings who were learning to understand each other by choice rather than compulsion. "Do you ever regret it?" Seraphine asked one evening as they watched the sunset from the palace balcony, her consciousness intertwined with his in patterns that grew more complex and beautiful with each passing day. "Destroying the Gene-Forge project." "Never." Darius smiled, feeling her amusement ripple through their shared neural link. "Though I do occasionally wonder what would have happened if I just stuck to fixing starship engines instead of accidentally revolutionizing galactic diplomacy." "You'd be bored out of your mind within a week," she replied, her 4 arms wrapped around him in a configuration that would have been impossible for human anatomy but felt perfectly natural now. "Besides, the engines you fix these days are considerably more interesting." "True. It's not every day you get to calibrate quantum drives that purr when they're happy and sulk when they need maintenance." "They don't sulk. They express disappointment through harmonic fluctuations." Same thing. The success of their partnership had become a template for others, though each Crown Code integration developed its own unique characteristics. Dr. Vasquez had established an entire research institute dedicated to studying consensual compatibility partnerships, and her findings suggested that conscious choice created stronger, more stable bonds than genetic programming ever could. "Arya," Darius called to his AI companion, who had adapted remarkably well to operating within a shared consciousness framework. "Status report on the voluntary integration program." "Currently tracking 4,733 active partnerships across 41 species, sir." "Success," rate is holding steady at 73%, with most failures attributed to incompatible personality types rather than biological rejection. And the political situation. 17 new diplomatic treaties signed this month. 3 border disputes resolved through cultural exchange programs. And the crystalline hegemony has formally requested human engineering consultants for their quantum infrastructure project.